starting with time. We're debating the resolution the Republicans started. I'm going to talk about my opponent's case, and then I'm going to jump to my off case just to let you know where we're going. He gives four contentions as to why the Republicans, he says, started this level of lack of bipartisanship in Congress. He talks about, his first point is the invasion of Iraq. He says that 88% of Americans supported going into Afghanistan, but not as many supported going into Iraq. My point is that Democrats voted for the use of force in Iraq. They had the same evidence, the same intelligence that George Bush had. They all thought Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and so they voted to go and use force in Iraq. They voted for it. The Republican president, a Democratic members of Congress voted to support that action. So the point where he says that shows that there's no bipartisanship, that flows to the negative automatically. He says that civil rights, he talks about torture, he talks about the Patriot Act, he talks about the Postal Act, he talks about the marriage amendment, and I asked him across examination, didn't some Democrats vote for this? Yes, all of these acts Republicans and Democrats voted for. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in my off case as to some other things that Republicans and Democrats voted for in George W. Bush's administration to show that Republicans and Democrats did have bipartisanship, and the Democrats, in fact, started the lack of stability in Congress that we have today. He talks about the tax cuts and the stimulus packages that were passed under George Bush's administration. Again, Democrats voted for this. And he talks about the fact that the tax cuts were passed by reconciliation. Now the Republicans say we can't use reconciliation. The fact is, reconciliation is designed as a budgetary item. It's designed to balance the budget and make adaptations and changes to the budget. Tax cuts relate to the budget. Health care does not relate to the budget. Okay, that's a major policy. Tax cuts relate directly to the budget, and so therefore they are valid to be passed by reconciliation. But the fact is, some Democrats voted for these things. No Republicans voted for the health care bill because they were shut out of the process. And I'll talk about that a little more in my off case as well. Then talk about the lack of civility and all these Republicans that say bad things have said bad things to Democrats and bad things about them. Does anybody remember people like Cindy Sheehan and Michael Moore and things that members of Congress said about George W. Bush? Burning effigies of George W. Bush, calling him a Nazi, saying that he is blood for oil. All of these things that Democrats have said about George W. Bush demonstrate the fact that Democrats are the ones that have the lack of stability. If anybody's showing stability, the Republicans are attempting to do this. And so going to my off case, I'm going to talk about how the fact that Republicans did not start this lack of stability in Washington. And I have four contentions. First is, let's look at some bipartisan efforts that were passed under George W. Bush. In George W. Bush's presidency, what bipartisan things were passed? Well, let's look at it. No Child Left Behind was a bipartisan piece of legislation passed under George W. Bush. Campaign finance reform was passed, bipartisanship. The Bush tax cuts, as I mentioned, were bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans voted for that. Supreme Court nominees. Harriet Miers was a Bush appointee to the Supreme Court. He withdrew her because Democrats and Republicans alike didn't like her, and so he withdrew that Supreme Court nominee specifically because Democrats and Republicans did not like her. That's evidence of bipartisanship. Medicare prescription drug coverage was bipartisanship. The stimulus plan, as my opponent mentioned, was passed on a bipartisan vote. Bipartisanship existed all throughout George W. Bush's presidency. The Democrats are the ones that have started this lack of bipartisanship, this lack of stability, if you will. Which leads me to my second point. Democrats instigated the lack of bipartisanship in Congress today. They started the divisive rhetoric before Republicans. Let's look at some of the things that they did. From the day George W. Bush was elected, they said, oh no, he was selected, not elected. They protested his election the entire 8 years he was in Congress. Anyone ever heard of an organization called MoveOn.org, or the Daily Kos, or Cindy Sheehan, as I mentioned, Blood for Oil, the 9/11 conspiracies that says that George W. Bush actually started 9/11, that it was his idea? This was all Democrats that were promoting this idea. And there's actually a movie that was actually produced that talked about how to kill George W. Bush. Bush and promoted the assassination of a president of the United States. It was done by Democrats. Democrats are the ones that started this lack of civility, not Republicans. My third contention is that when Democrats control two branches of Congress, when Democrats have been in charge of the House, the Congress, and the presidency, things don't get done. When Bill Clinton was president and we had a Republican Congress, things got passed. Welfare reform, for example. When we had a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, things got passed. As I just mentioned, all the things that were passed under George W. Bush. But when we have a Democratic president and a Democratic supermajority, we can't get things passed. Nothing gets done. And my fourth point is, let's look at some, this is just some facts. My point was to look at some possible causes. What are some possible causes of this lack of civility? Well, the media. The media polarizes people. You either have to watch Fox News, you have to watch MSNBC. You don't have a mid-ground. The fact that we're having this debate simply shows that there's divisiveness, and it wasn't started by the Republicans. It was started by Democrats. And I'm sitting ready for crossing.
Other than the health care bill you mentioned before, has there ever been a bill passed that didn't have people from both parties voting on it?
As we talked about in my cross-examination, I don't believe there's ever another bill that passed with no one from one party voting.
Okay, so if that's the case, how does the fact that bipartisanship exists in every bill somehow prove the Republicans weren't responsible?
For the health care bill?
No, not the health care bill, but for all these other things. How does bipartisanship negate Republican responsibility?
The Republicans took responsibility and they brought Democrats in under George W. Bush's presidency. The fact is, since Obama has been president, Republicans have been locked out of ideas such as healthcare decision-making. They had secret meetings at the White House that Republicans were not fighting.
Didn't Republicans make over 200 amendments to the healthcare bill?
Yes, and they were all stricken by the Democratic Party. That was not open to any Republican input into this bill.
So the Republicans made 200 amendments in these secret meetings they weren't part of. Is that your...
No, they made it in when it finally got to the floor of the Senate, but they were all stricken.
Let's talk about the 9/11.
They were kept out of the meeting.
Let's talk about 9/11 conspirators for a second. Are those exclusively Democrats?
I would say 99% of them, yes, are Democrats.
Do you have any warrant to provide this, or is this just your opinion?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I really don't, I guess.
MoveOn.org, is that affiliated with the Democratic Party, or is that...
Not officially, but it is a Democratic movement. Okay. It is George Soros who funds Democrats in every election possible.
Is there a difference between being a liberal and being a Democrat?
I don't think so.
What's a blue dog?
A blue dog is supposedly a moderate Democrat, but there is no fiscally